in that space. Then the next question is whether there will be an intake in July or possibly September. And really, we don't have an answer for that yet. We don't know. John and I are actively engaged in a conversation currently with government, and government is certainly looking at this and trying to work out how it might be possible to have a managed border where there are some exemptions for international students to enter New Zealand. But this is obviously highly complex because they must put the health interests of New Zealanders first. So any students that are allowed to enter the country will have to undertake a 2-week managed isolation or quarantine. And that won't be, you know, isolating in a homestay like it was earlier in the year. That will be in a managed facility like a motel, for example. And there's a lot to work out. There's a lot of different industries in the country that would like a border open. And so it's going to take some time to work through those issues and for the government to make those decisions. And those are decisions that won't be made by us, although we will feed into the discussion and make suggestions, and we will help to coordinate once that is open. But the decision is a government decision, and it seems as though July is probably going to be too soon for all of that to be worked out. There's a little tiny possibility there might still be a chance for July, but I think September is more likely, or even January. So, you know, please just be patient, and we hope that in another couple of weeks there will be more clarity around this and we'll have more answers. So we just don't know yet if there'll be a July intake or a September intake. But I know that there have been agents asking schools to please issue an offer of place and a fee invoice, and our advice to schools has been not to do that, simply to issue an acceptance letter and then to wait for visa processing to resume and for us to know that there's a border opening before they issue an offer and invoice, because we don't want families paying large amounts of fees and then those fees having to be refunded, and it gets quite messy and complicated. So, Immigration New Zealand has also said that they prefer that people do not lodge visa applications until processing resumes. So please wait for those messages from Immigration New Zealand that they're going to resume processing before you lodge applications for later this year and for January as well.
And Jennifer, I could just add there, you know, I think the fact that our immigration offices offshore are closed and still not processing any visas that are lodged from offshore, the closer we get to July and those offices remain closed, then I think that's a strong indication of the possibility of having a July intake. So, you know, that is a key marker in the decision making, is the closure of those offices. And at the moment, you know, they are still closed. So,
yes, thanks, John. So some questions coming through here about when the border opens and it's a managed border, and the isolation period, and if that's going to depend on government regulations or so. So self-isolation is not the right terminology there, because it's not self-isolation, it's managed isolation, which basically means that the students would arrive at the airport, they would get put on a bus, they would get taken to a facility, which might be a motel or a boarding house. They would be looked after there, they would have food supplied to them. We totally understand your point about them being minor student and needing a high level of care. And that's one of the reasons that CEBO has offered to be involved in coordinating that. We don't know exactly what that will look like yet, but I can assure you that they will be well taken care of and looked after. And it may be that we'll be delivering some orientation to them online while they're in that isolation. We'll have somebody checking in with them every day to make sure they're okay. We'll have first language support who will be engaging with them. It probably won't be in person because of the fact that they've been isolated and quarantined, but we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. I can't give you details. I'm just speculating about what that will look like because it hasn't been worked out yet. But what I can say is that the students will be properly looked after and safe and cared for. So, you know, and that's one of the things that makes it really complicated is working out how we can make sure of that when they are very young students. And it may be to start with that there's certain categories of students that are allowed in first and then others later. We just don't really know yet. But it will be the governments will make those decisions, and then once we get the framework from them, we'll work out the details. It won't be the school organising it, we don't think. It will be centrally organised. But safety and well-being will be our #1 priority. So you're saying, will they have supervision from some staff of the school, and what will other programs be during their isolation? Do you think this isolation for 2 weeks will prevent students from going? So we're not sure yet. We don't really know what they'll have in the way of supervisors. It depends on what structures are put in place. I think that, you know, the only students who will be able to come will be those that are willing to undergo an isolation period. And it may be also that the government will look at what COVID is doing in different countries and taking students from countries that have a lower infection rate. I think all of those things are being considered at the moment, but we don't really know what it's going to look like. It may put some students off, but we hope that they'll be willing to. We'll make sure that they've got activities to keep them busy during those 2 weeks. Some orientation material.
It's really important to kind of share too that, you know, at this point in the process, it's still very early following the announcement by the Minister that there is now discussion around opening the borders. And there's a lot of planning to do to make sure that when the borders do open, it is done safely, both for New Zealanders, but also for those young people coming in as international students. And, you know, we certainly hear the caution around that we are, you know, dealing with young students under 18, and there's a certain, there's a heightened level of care required because they are so young. In terms of planning for that, who will care for them, where they'll be cared for, you know, those questions, you know, we haven't yet got to the point where we can start working those out, and we're still really waiting on the high-level guidelines from our Ministry of Health around what a quarantine program or a managed isolation program might look like. And once we know what the health requirements are for those programs, then and that is managed by our Ministry of Health. Once those guidelines are set, then through the Ministry of Education, we will be working with them to look at how then that is implemented for school students if they are included in that program. So it's very early days. I know it's not that helpful for you, but we certainly will, you know, through ENZ and Genevieve, when we do know more about that, we'll certainly let you know.
There's a couple more questions about this, which we don't know the answers to, but we'll do our best. One question is whether students travelling together in a group would stay together in a group for those 2 weeks. I mean, that certainly would make sense to me if I were arranging it, that if they've all flown together in a group and they've had contact with each other, they may as well stay together for those 2 weeks. So I would hope that that would be the case. And a good question is who's going to pay for it. We don't really know that yet, whether it will be paid for partly by the students, partly by the government, partly by the school, or whether, I think that there will be some cost to the students, but I'm hoping that that won't be a huge burden. But that's being worked out. That's part of what has to be worked out. And then Eva's asking, will the isolation be managed by schools or other authorities, or will parents and agents have to take care of that? No, parents and agents will not have to take care of that. It will be arranged by New Zealand authorities, and it's probably going to be me and John and some people in our team helping us. that are going to arrange a lot of the details for school students. The most important thing is that we will make sure that these students are well cared for and that they're not put at risk in any way. Their safety and their well-being are the most important things. If we can't look after those things, we won't go ahead and let them in. So please don't worry about that. We will make sure that they're well cared for. And we will let you know more details as soon as we have them. A couple of questions relating to visas. Should we not lodge any files online at the moment? That is what Immigration New Zealand is saying. Please don't lodge any visa applications yet, because there's just no offshore processing happening. What they're doing, they have got the branch in Palmerston North open. They're busy clearing the backlog of onshore applications, and once they've done that, they do have capacity to move some of the offshore applications that were lodged online and process those in New Zealand. So I think that they will start doing that as soon as they can, but Celia will be able to talk to you more about that when she comes on the webinar next week. So is there any possible offshore applications can be looked at by the High Commission in Wellington? Yes, some of the offshore applications I think will be processed in New Zealand, but they are prioritising applications for different categories of visa. And while the border is closed and students can't come in, I think that they're going to put those applications as a lower priority because they can't come in anyway, so they'll wait until borders are open to start processing those. But Celia will give you more information on that. Are there any more questions there, John, that we haven't answered yet? So somebody's asking me to confirm that you mentioned the intake in January would be most likely to happen and the schools accept applications for 2021. I think the same applies for applications for 2021 as for July, which is that they won't be issuing offers because we don't know yet whether the border will be completely open for January or whether it will only be open for certain categories of students. So until we know that, I think we're advising schools not to issue offers, but they can issue a letter of acceptance. And we'll hopefully know within the next few weeks to a month on exactly what the border openings will look like.
There's a question there from Isabel around New Zealand should organise a visa office within New Zealand and not offshore for the coming application processes. They, again, at the moment, and I think a lot of these questions are best directed at immigration, but our understanding at the moment is that New Zealand, they are processing some visas onshore, but those are for students that are currently onshore. And there are not any plans that we know about for moving any of the offshore processing to New Zealand at this stage, but they are certainly looking at how they can adjust their processes and their flow to start processing visas when that happens.
I think Celia did say on our webinar last week, John, that they were thinking about that and looking at it as an option, that they did have the capacity to bring some of those offshore applications to New Zealand. So they're certainly thinking about that, but I don't know to what extent or when they'll start doing that.
I think one of the main features of the new framework for processing visas is that they can move the workload around those three centres, Mumbai, Beijing and New Zealand, and they can do that depending on demand. And I would be sure that once the demand starts to come in, then they can prioritise and move that workflow around to make sure that the backlog is cleared in as quick a time as possible.